This video will examine the use of grid, snap, and object snap in AutoCAD. Grid, snap, and object snap are all tools that are used to increase precision and accuracy when making drawings. The grid is this graph paper set up here to help you estimate distances. Snap controls the movement of the mouse and limits the movement of the mouse to predetermined points. And object snap helps you to select points on objects when prompted to select a point in AutoCAD. We'll begin by looking at the grid. If I come down to the status bar down here at the bottom, you'll see that on my grid icon it says that the grid, to display the drawing grid, it's on. If I press F7, it'll toggle that grid off and on. If I wanted to type the command, you could type in grid mode, or the easiest way is just to right click on here, choose grid settings, and it launches the drafting settings dialog box with the snap and grid tab set as current. You'll see that the grid is currently turned on. I can uncheck that box, which would turn the grid off, or I could press F7, which would do the same thing. Coming down here to the grid spacing, you'll see that my grid spacing as a default is set to 0.5, but if I wanted it, say, to set to 1 inch, I could type 1 there. Notice that when I come down here and select the second box, it makes the Y spacing match the X spacing. If I didn't want those to be equal for some reason, I could uncheck this box over here, which requires it to have equal X and Y spacing, and then I could set them differently. The next one down here has a major line every 5. So you'll notice right here that we have kind of a brighter grid line and then some darker gray grid lines and then another brighter grid line. Again, it's just to help you to estimate distances. If I know that I have a grid X spacing of, say, 0.5 and then a major line every 5, then I would know that that's 2.5 inches, 5 inches, 7.5 inches, and so on. If I leave that where it is now and I choose OK, the grid again is just helping me to determine, to kind of estimate distances. So I could pick a point. I would know that that's about 5 inches, and then that's about 2.5 inches. But if I wanted to get exactly at 5 inches, it's very difficult with using just the grid to get exactly to 5 inches. Notice that I'm at 4.9905, but then if I move my mouse a little more, you see that it jumps right over to 5.0023. It's very difficult to get exactly to an exact number using just the grid. So for that reason, we have instead what we call snap. If I go back down here, right next to the grid mode, there is one for snap mode. If I right click on that, I can choose snap settings, which again takes me back to this same dialog box, but I can turn my snap on. Okay, now what snap is going to do is to limit the movement of my cursor to predetermined points. The default for my snap spacing is 0.5, which matches my grid. I'm just going to choose OK here. And it doesn't actually become effective until I decide that I want to draw something. So I'm going to go ahead and erase these real quick. Enter. Now when I come in here and I say I want to draw a line, notice that my mouse only moves now to the grid. And my mouse only moves to the grid because of the way that I have that set up. My grid spacing and my snap spacing are exactly the same. But if I wanted to draw lines, it's very easy now to draw lines that are exactly those increments long. The smallest increment that I can draw is 1/2 inch. Now you can override that. If I wanted to go, say, 2 3/4, I could still stretch this out the direction I want to go, type in 2.75, enter, and now I've got a line there that's in between, but it's just a temporary override. Going back to my snap, what you want to do is set your snap spacing usually at a distance that's smaller than your grid spacing, but something that makes sense. So for example, if I wanted 1/8 of an inch snap spacing, I could type in 0.125, or I could even type in 1/8 for an eighth of an inch, press enter. Now notice that when I come in to use my command, that I'm not just limited to just the grid, but I can move every eighth of an inch. Every time my cursor moves, it's an eighth of an inch, which allows me to have a level of precision, but not so big that it's difficult to use. It allows me to really get in here and create maybe some technical drawings when my minimum measurement is at an increment of an eighth of an inch. So that's grid and snap. It's important to remember that you want to use settings for grid and snap that make sense. If I was doing an architectural drawing where I was doing maybe a layout of a factory, my grid might be something like 4 feet. Where I'm working with a large facility, it wouldn't make sense to have a grid that was a half of an inch on something that large. And likewise, my snap on that manufacturing facility might be something like 2 feet or 12 inches or 6 inches. But if I was doing something small, like maybe I was making the plan for a small microchip or something like that, my grid might be 1/10 of an inch, and my snap might be something like 1/100 of an inch, depending on what it is you're working on. You want to set those to where they make sense. Object snaps provide a way to specify precise locations on objects whenever you are prompted for a point within a command. So for example, let's say I had a few objects on the screen here. I've got a circle, perhaps. Maybe I've got a rectangle that goes along with that. And let's just draw a triangle as well. Like that. So I've got some objects on my screen. I'm going to turn my snap off for this. So I'll right click here, go to Object Snap Settings. Again, to turn the snap off, I can uncheck this box, or I can press F9 to toggle it off. I'll just uncheck the box there. Now let's say that I wanted to draw a line that went from the center of this circle to the end point of this line. Without object snaps, it would be very difficult to find the center of this circle. But when I come to the line command and I come over here and get close to this circle, you'll see that a little circle pops up, and then on my cursor it says center. That is an object snap. As soon as that object snap pops up, all I have to do is click, and I know now that that line is attached to the center of that circle perfectly. If I want to go to the end point of this line, again, all I got to do is get close to the end point of that line. As soon as that little icon pops up and it says endpoint, I can click with my mouse, and I know that it is attached exactly to that endpoint there. Okay. Now there are several different object snaps that you can use. If you want to see the whole list, you will hold the Shift key and right click your mouse, and it brings up the object snap lists. They start with endpoint, midpoint, okay, would be the midpoint of a line, the intersection of two lines. The apparent intersection would be two lines that don't intersect, but if they did, where they would intersect. Extension, center of circle, geometric center of a block or something like that. Quadrant. The quadrant points on a circle are 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. Tangent, perpendicular to an object, parallel to an object. A node, which is an insertion, a point, the insertion point of something. Nearest will let you get, it'll just make sure that it's actually on the object, and then none would override those. Okay, so if I wanted to say go from the quadrant of this circle, the 12 o'clock there, to the end point there, I would use quadrant. Okay, if I wanted it just to be tangent, I would use that one. So for example, if I come in here and I say line and then shift right click and I choose tangent, so when I get close to the circle, you'll notice that I get this deferred tangent. I click, and now notice that no matter where I draw my line, it's going to make it look tangent. Okay, so if I come up here and maybe pick that endpoint there, it gives me tangent. Okay. Notice that if I do a shift right click, I'm at the command line. I'm not in a command right now. If I do shift right click and I choose a tangent or an object snap right now, say endpoint, I get an error message that says endpoint, unknown command to endpoint. Press F1 for help. So these are not commands by themselves. They're just tools to use while you're actually working with commands. Now you'll notice that I can, if I come in here, if I get close to a circle, it automatically gives me center, okay? Or if I get close to a line, it automatically gives me the endpoint, or in my case, the midpoint, okay? Or if I come over here, it also gives me intersection. These are what we call running object snaps. I don't want to have everything on at one time, but these are the ones that I'm using most often. To look at your running object snaps, you go again to shift right click to get this list and choose object snap settings at the bottom. These are the object snaps that are running at the point. So right now I've got endpoint, midpoint, center, node, and intersection running. My advice to you is to turn on only the ones that you need. There are some people who think that if having these 4 is good, then having all of them turned on is better, but that's not true, because what you end up with is kind of this schizophrenic drawing where it can't figure out which one you want. And there's also a hierarchy. For example, if I have center on and I also have tangent on, 99% of the time it's going to give me the center and not the tangent. So if I want to use tangent and have it running, then what I'll do is I'll clear all these off and I'll have it set to tangent, and maybe I'll leave endpoint on. So I can say, okay, I want a line that goes from tangent here to the endpoint there to tangent there, okay? But if I had that object snap setting with center on, notice that I've got center and tangent on here. When I come in here now, it always wants to give me the center one. It's not going to give me the option to do tangent. So again, what you want to do is set your object snaps to the ones that are appropriate for the work that you're doing at the time, and leave the rest of them off. So again, for me, those are endpoint, midpoint, center point, and intersection. One last thing about object snaps is that if you have one and you're trying to get a different one, let's say I've come in here and I want, it's set to endpoint or something like that, but I don't want any endpoint or any object snap at all, I can choose none, and it turns them all off for until I click. Once I click, now they're back on. So it's just a one-time off type of a deal. Finally, it's important to know that you must use object snap when you're doing an AutoCAD drawing. AutoCAD drawings are considered to be incorrect if you're not using object snaps. So if I were to come in here, for example, and I'm going to turn this off to none, and I'm just going to get in here and make that look like it goes to the endpoint of that line there. So that looks like it's connected, and it looks good from afar, but if I roll my wheel and zoom up on it, you'll see that it actually does not connect. Okay, so this would be considered incorrect in an AutoCAD drawing, and you would always want to make sure that you are using those object snaps, so that indeed, now that I had that object snap and I stretch that out, no matter how close I zoom up on this, they are all 3 of those are exactly at the same point. This concludes the video for grid, snap, and object snap.